Scripture reading this morning will be in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 12 through 15. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version, Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 12. Therefore lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled.
Good morning. Good to see everybody. I'm kind of continuing on with the theme been talking about for a little bit, and that is the schemes of the devil. As Paul talks about in another passage, that we are not ignorant of the schemes of the devil. And one of those is bitterness. And we're going to talk a little bit about bitterness and maybe some of its root causes, but I want to kind of highlight the idea of having an adversary. And as Peter talks about, knowing that Satan is like a roaring lion. I mean, if we could hear roaring lions, we would be afraid if they knew they were nearby, and we would take action. A lot of times, though, we don't know Satan is roaming around us, as Peter is trying to get us to understand he is. And so one of the books in the Bible that really help us understand this is the book of Job. And many of us might know the general principles or general teachings in the book of Job. And Satan essentially, attacking him, God giving him the ability to attack him because God is saying how faithful he is and that he does what is right. And Satan basically makes the claim, well, he only does that because of the boundaries you've set around him and around his family and around his household, which is an important topic, by the way, to understand that Satan's boundaries are always set by God. And so whether you and I have the same boundaries of Job might be a different issue, but the reality is God is the one that set those boundaries, and he allowed Satan to attack Job in a very physical way, not only to attack his flesh, but to have killed his family. And then using his wife to berate him for he must be some terrible person that all of these terrible things would happen to him. So she basically curses him and tells him that he ought to die. And then his three of his closest friends come and sit with him for a week, which is actually quite a statement of their concern for him. And yet most of the book is about the conversations between he and his three friends about why all of these terrible things have befallen him. And we think about, just losing family might get us angry with God, might cause us to turn away from trying to do what is right, might cause us to walk a different path, or physical disease, as he had, boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, incredibly painful, so that he was cutting them open with just broken shards of pottery. And so you can imagine how much pain you'd be in to just start scratching your skin open. And yet, in some ways, the real difficulties, I think, come from his wife and then also his friends. And now his wife seems to be really angry at him and blaming him. But his friends appear to come to him and say these things out of a care and concern for him. Their intentions appear to be good, but can you imagine how bitter he might have been by the treatment he received from his wife and his friends if God had not appeared to them and talked with them directly at the end of it? If he had not come to them and told all of his friends that they needed to repent and have Job forgive them? If they hadn't been aware of all of that, can you imagine how bitter you might be? Because a lot of times bitterness comes upon us because of pain or hurt that we receive from other people. Sometimes being mean to us, but sometimes out of good intentions people hurt us, and we get bitter. It's a common human problem. It's not just a church problem. It happens in families. It happens in workplaces. It happens all the time in every kind of social problem or any kind of social network. People get bitter over what has been said or done to them. And it's one of the great schemes or dangers of the devil to attack us. And we're going to come back to this passage in Hebrews 12. We're going to pretty much end with it, much like we started with it. But I want to point out a couple of things here in this passage that Ben already read for us. And that he says, therefore lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees. Now, it kind of sounds like he's telling you to just kind of buck up and, take care of yourself. But the your here, by the way, is not singular. If it was kind of put in southern drawl, it would be all y'all need to do this. This is not a singular person problem. This is a group problem. This is us looking out for all of us to make sure others who are weak, they don't have the response. Somebody who's so weak that they can't walk, can't bind it up themselves. They need to have others help in that process. And so that's what he's talking about. This is an us thing about making straight paths for your feet. If you don't have knees and legs that work well, and by the way, straight paths don't mean straight this way. They mean straight this way. They mean level. When Janae broke her tibia, 6 weeks or so ago, maybe a little more than that, well, I spent a lot of time at my house because I have no steps. And even from the driveway to my step, there's one 4-inch step and then another little 4-inch step. Because they have 3 steps up into their house. Too difficult, right? Making straight paths is about, especially when people don't walk well. What you do is you smooth out the path. And that's what it's talking about. Well, they're not smoothing out their own path. We are smoothing the path for them. We are trying to help them and prepare a place for them to be able to do this. Now, it's not just talking about physical ailments, though. I'm going to show you that here in a minute. But the idea of bitterness, when he talks about, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. Because bitterness doesn't just damage one person, typically. It usually causes a lot of trouble. Because people not only, very often when there's bitterness, people begin to kind of talk to other people, not the right person, but talk to other people and get them on their side. And you hear your friend or your family member tell you about this horrible thing somebody's done to you, and then you start taking up their side of it. And then the other person talks about to their friends and their family and kind of build up their side. And pretty soon you have a Hatfield and McCoy's problem. A common human dilemma that falls upon all of us. And so we're going to come back to this. I want to look at a couple of other passages just talking about the idea of bitterness. In Ephesians chapter 4 and 30 to 32, it starts with the idea of bitterness with don't grieve the Holy Spirit. In chapter 4 of Ephesians, it starts in verse 30, and do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Now, this is in that passage where he's telling us to put off that old man, that one we crucified, and said, I'm not going to walk in that way anymore. I'm going to walk with Christ, and I'm going to do the things Christ has taught me. And there he's telling us, you've got to take these things and you've got to nail them to the cross. And here's what you do instead. Because the way you put things off is don't just go, well, I'm not going to do that. Give you an example. Let's say you have the habit, maybe. You always want to finish dinner with something sweet, right? And so how good will you be at just going, never anything sweet again? You probably won't be that good at that. You probably won't be successful at just simply removing it. You will probably have most success when you replace it with something else better. So maybe the sweet thing at the end is fruit. Or maybe it's, no sugar added something. Whatever it might be better for you than what you're trying to get rid of. And the same thing is true in this process of trying to be godly. When we try to put off our old habits on our old man, very often in order to break those habits, you have to replace that with something that's good. And that's what he's telling them. Instead of being bitter, wrathful, angry, clamor, slander, you be kind, tenderhearted, forgiving. You do those things instead. Now, did he say, that they have no reason to be bitter? No, and in fact, even in the book, it talks about how we have to bear with one another. Why do we have to bear with one another? Because we're going to hurt each other. Sometimes because maybe we're not having a good day and we lash out. Sometimes we might be like Job's friends and trying to help and we hurt somebody. So we're going to have to bear with one another. Sometimes it's simply miscommunication. I say something and somebody takes it a different way than what I meant. And so there's all kinds of reasons that we end up having strife and difficulties. But one of the things we don't want to have is let bitterness, that anger, build up so that it becomes wrath, that our anger hangs around. Clamor, which is that argumentative nature that's going on. All those things. But it comes all in the context of don't grieve the Holy Spirit. He sealed you for the day of redemption. Don't do these things. And then one other passage, Philippians chapter 4 and in 2 and 3. And this is kind of a specific example with two women who were in a church at Philippi. These were not bad women. Paul describes them as fellow laborers who labored with him side by side in the gospel, along with Clement and other fellow workers, and their names are written in the book of life. That's who these women are. These are fellow laborers with Paul. And for some reason, they are at odds with one another. And he writes in a letter to the whole church, I am entreating Euodia and Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women. So one of the fellow workers probably receiving this letter from Paul, he's saying, I need you to help. Because what do we have here? There is a root of bitterness that has sprung up that's visible. And you need to help them. Why? Because like Hebrews tells us, it's not going to defile just them. It's going to defile a lot of other people too. And so he kind of urges them, you've got to take care of this problem. Now, I mentioned that people tend to talk, but not always talk to the right person. When people have hurt us, we need to talk with them. And a couple of passages that I think are important, Matthew 18, verse 15. And we look at this whole passage, and I'm just going to look at the verse 15 here. But there's more steps kind of to trying to solve the problem. But I want to focus on the first part of that. He says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. The reason we talk to the person who may have hurt us is that we want to gain them. If they are sinning, we want to help them. Sometimes, I used to think for a very longest time, I always kind of, in my mind, I had this whole process, and then if that doesn't work, you bring 2 or 3 others, and then if that doesn't work, take it to the church. I used to think of it as in order for me to forgive them, but I think the motivation isn't about me. The motivation is about them. If somebody is sinning, I want to help them. I want them to be gained back to God. This idea of gaining your brother is exactly the same term used about preaching the gospel. That you might gain. Paul himself talks about, becoming all things, all people, that he might gain some. That's the goal. That's the purpose. We want to make sure that none of us are going to get lost or damaged or defiled or give up. We're trying to make sure that each of us are going to be able to keep going, walking in the Lord and following his path. And so you got to talk to him. Between you and him alone, you don't talk to other people before that person. Now, the whole passage describes the idea that maybe that conversation doesn't go well. And it gives us advice about what to do after that. But it starts there. But too often, that is not where it starts with us. It starts with us and talking to other people. And that simply builds up clamor, slander, and creates division and turmoil. Now, this is actually mirrored in the law of Moses in Leviticus 19 and verse 17. One of the commandments, it's in a list of commandments, so it's one of those commandments kind of not really in a context other than he's giving a list of things to do or not do. And he says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. Now notice the difference here. That in Matthew 18, so they've sinned against you, so you're feeling pretty righteous, right? They're the awful ones. And I'm going to go to them and fix them. But sometimes what happens to us that this passage talks about is they have done something awful, hurt me in some way, and now I have anger. I'm upset. And I need to be careful. That's what this commandment is talking about. I need to be careful that that doesn't linger in me. And he's telling us, and I might end up sinning out of this problem. So I need to reason with this brother. But you notice that the brother also became the neighbor in the passage? This isn't about just one another in the church. This is about you and your neighbor by your home. This is about you and your coworker someplace. This is a principle that as godly people we should practice with everybody. Because after all, as the lawyer asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? Jesus obviously gave an answer he didn't really love. But for all of us, we got to talk to people and be willing to hear them, not just tell them, but what actually are they thinking? What were they intending? What were they meaning? I need to be able to hear that and listen to that. Now, we do all of this that we may receive the grace of God. That's actually, we're going to come back to Hebrews 12. There we go. In Hebrews 12, and I want to talk about the whole thing from the beginning, because I want to put it a bit in kind of a broader context of Hebrews 12, and really chapter 11 as well. Because Hebrews 12 starts with, therefore we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, or the word is really martyrs. But, and he's talking about all those that he's mentioned in chapter 11. He says, look at all these people, all of these martyrs that died because of their faith in God. They were attacked, they were persecuted, and suffered in different ways, but they kept the faith. They kept going in that faith. And that's what he's trying to get us to do. And so he's saying we need to, in order to do this, run this race, he says we need to look to Jesus, try to follow his example. And we need to lay aside the weight, the burdens, the things that have kind of come on us that are not important. They might not be bad. They might just not be that important in terms of faithfulness and salvation. And so he's saying, lay aside the things that are just not that important. And also lay aside the sin, which clings so closely. Notice he mentions, you don't just lay aside sin, right? That's more like you're trying to get the static, you're trying to get maybe, for those who may have a cat or a dog, you're trying to get it off of you, right? You got to get something special because you just can't sit there and just like wipe it off. It doesn't wipe off. It's like keeps clinging. You have to put out extra effort to get rid of it. It has a tendency to just, grab on and not want to let go. And so we need to run this race with endurance. So then he goes into in verse 3, don't grow weary. We haven't endured from sinners such hostility against. So we look to Jesus who endured all this hostility, but we haven't endured to that point. We haven't resisted to bloodshed, he says in verse 4. And then he says, have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him, for the Lord disciplines the one he loves, chastises every son whom he receives. The parent who has no longer loving and caring about their children gives up. So if you're being disciplined by God, he still loves you. That's what he's telling us. And he's telling us that this discipline in verse 7 is something we have to endure. It's for discipline, because the idea of being disciplined is we're not enduring so they can discipline us. We are enduring so we can develop self-discipline. Because that's the purpose of being disciplined, is that people can learn from it in order to self-discipline. And so God is treating you as sons, he says. And he goes on, he talks about discipline of our own parents and how they did as best they could, and we respected them. In verse 10, they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Discipline has the purpose of training. And he says, and then we come into this passage we started with, and that is there, and it ends with therefore. Because of this whole thing of us trying to walk with God, trying to endure and keep going with Christ, and to go through the same process that he went through, to endure the difficulties, to overcome all of the trials, and to press on and go all the way to the end. He says, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. That was an exhortation to the whole group, saying, you need to take care of one another who are struggling and who are feeling weak. You need to help them. You need to help strengthen them. You need to help bind up their legs or make the path easy for them to walk. This isn't about just you alone. This is about us doing this for one another. And so he says, strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. And now I'll stop there because I want to go back, because it doesn't really read like it here. But the beginning of verse 12 is actually a quote from the Old Testament. And a lot of times we wouldn't, if we were just reading here, we wouldn't really recognize that. He doesn't say it's a quote. He doesn't say, well, did Isaiah say something like that? But if we're gonna go back, let's go back to Isaiah, and Isaiah 35, and we're going to end here. But I want you to see in Isaiah 35 specifically what the conclusion of this whole point was about the feeble hands and the weak knees. The whole passage, the whole chapter is talking about how God will redeem and his people who have been ransomed. And a price has to be paid to bring them back. And he's going to do that. And when he does that, he's going to raise them up. And so he says the wilderness, and he gives an analogy at the beginning. The wilderness and dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it. The majesty of Carmel and Sharon. And they shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. So he's talking about this dry desert place that's going to now be lush and full of, plants and flowers and water. And it's just an analogy about taking people who are just feeling like we're struggling to get by, and he's going to make us bloom. So he then says, strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. That's the part that Hebrews 12 is talking about. You've got to strengthen those weak hands. By the way, weak hands essentially means hands that are unable. How do you strengthen hands that are unable? Is it you're like, well, here's the passage telling you to work out. How do I help somebody else who has weak hands? So if my hands are weak, I can't necessarily make them strong. But other people can give me help in that. Other people can aid me. They can give me and help me with things so that my weak hands are allowed to still work. And so he says, say to those, by the way, this concept, strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees, this is actually something that is said in Job. That is described. Job was like that. He did those things. That's the kind of person he was. That he had strengthened those who were weak. That he had taken care of those who were unable. And he says, and again in verse 4, say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Look, your God will come with vengeance. Vengeance means to set it right. And he's saying, our God, he says, with the recompense of God, he is going to pay everybody what they deserve. This is why it's so important to understand grace, because we're not going to get what we deserve. We're going to get grace. We're going to get a gift that we don't deserve. And so he says, and the end of verse 4, I think, is the important part of all of this. We're strengthening the hands. We're firming up the legs that aren't working well. We're trying to say to the heart and mind that is feeling anxious and afraid, be strong. Don't be afraid. Look, God is going to come. And what's he going to do? He will come and save you. We are not strengthening people so they can do it on their own. We are not encouraging them so you're going to become so strong that you'll be able to do it on your own. That's not the lesson. The lesson is us helping people who are struggling, who are feeling weak and unable, so that we can just keep going until God comes and saves us. That's the point. That's why we have to be careful with bitterness. It's not because one of the biggest problems of bitterness is that we can feel like we have real reasons to be bitter. We feel justified for our hatred for what somebody has done, for the hurt that has been foisted upon us. But we have to think in a bigger picture. I need to get rid of that so that I can keep going, that God might save me and lift me up. And that's where the passage goes. And I want you to notice the next verses. He's talking about, he will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, the lame man shall leap like a deer, and the tongues of the mute sing for joy, for waters break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. Going back to the first analogy. But he just used those things that Jesus did. So when Jesus did those things in Israel, do you think they were unaware of this passage in Isaiah? That they didn't know these were things God was going to do? It was prophesied. And we were shown these things. And so I want to come down here, verse 8. And a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk on the way. Even if they are fools, they shall not go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. And they shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads, and they shall obtain gladness and joy and sorrow, and sighing shall flee away. He's telling us by helping one another, by getting rid of the bitterness and the anger and the clamor, we're doing this so that we don't stumble and fall. And we are helping each other in this too, when we see it in other people, or we see signs or hints or springs of it in other people. We want to help them so that it doesn't hurt the whole. And because we're trying to hang in and hang on and press on until he raises us up. We're going to end there today. I probably have one or two. I haven't decided if I'm going to combine the next two or do them as separate ones. But I'm going to talk about a couple more topics in terms of the schemes of the devil and things we need to be thinking about. These things come upon us. They're normal parts of life, and they are ways to get us to trip and fall and give up. And God is urging us to keep going. Hang on. Keep pressing on. And in that process, we need each other in that. That is not just me being strong enough. That is us working and talking and supporting each other and doing the things necessary. And so we're going to close out this morning. I appreciate your time. If you're in need, as I'm just talking about, this is about us, not about any of us individually. And we are here to help one another. And if you're in need in any way, please let us know how we can serve you today. Let's go ahead and stand and sing.
Wait. Zaylee and I have something to give everybody for the church.
The song.
The song?
Yeah, let's do it after the song.
Oh, good.